네, 그럼 지금부터 그 2014년 스테피 국제 심포지움을 개최하도록 하겠습니다. 저는 사회를 맡은 과학기술정책연구원의 이우성 연구위원입니다. 네, 먼저 참석하여 주셔서 주신 여러분께 감사와 환영의 인사를 드리고 싶습니다. 특별히 먼저 이 자리를 빛내주시기 위해 참석해 주신 내외 귀빈분들을 좀 소개해 드리도록 하겠습니다. 과학기술자문회의의 박상대 부의장님, 산업기술연구회 장훈함 이사장님, 한국여성정책연구원 최금숙 원장님, 한국과학기술기획평가원 박영하 원장님, 한국에너지기술평가원 안남성 원장님, 세계여성발명기업인협회 한미영 회장님, 과학기술계 원로이신 박원훈 박사님, 그리고 GII 프로젝트 매니저이신 안드레아 이렇게 참석해 주셨습니다. 참석해 주신 네 분께 감사 말씀드리면서 박수 부탁드리겠습니다. 바쁘신 일정 가운데서도 저희 스테피 국제 심포지움에 참석해 주신 많은 내외 기빈분들과 참석자분들에게 진심으로 감사를 먼저 드리겠습니다. 먼저 국민의례부터 하겠습니다. 모두 자리에서 일어나서 정민의 태극기를 향하여 주시기를 바랍니다. 국기에 대하여 경례.
나는 자랑스러운 태극기야. 자유롭고 정의로운 대한민국의 흉한 영광을 위하여 충성을 다할 것을 굳게 다짐합니다.
네, 바로 애국가 제창을 생략하도록 하겠습니다. 다음은 세월호 희생자에 대한 묵념하는 시간을 잠시 갖도록 하겠습니다. 묵념. 네, 바로 착석해 주시기 바랍니다. 이제부터 스테피 행사를 시작하도록 하겠습니다. 저희 스테피 이번 국제 심포지움의 주제는 창조경제, 국가혁신 시스템을 되돌아보다입니다. 먼저 과학기술정책연구회 원장님이신 송정국 원장님의 개회서가 있도록 하겠습니다. 참석분들께서 뜨거운 박수로 환영 부탁드리겠습니다.
네, 안녕하십니까. 과학기술정책연구원 송종국입니다. 먼저 바쁘신 일정에도 불구하고 스테피 국제 심포지움 개최를 축하하기 위해 참석해 주신 박상대 국가과학기술자문회의 부의장님께 감사 말씀을 드립니다. 그리고 우리 장원남 이사장님, 박영하 원장님을 비롯한 많은 귀빈 여러분께도 감사의 말씀 드립니다. 또한 오늘 심포지움 발표를 위해서 한국을 방문하신 소ete 마스트리히트 대학 총장님, 찰스 에드퀴스트 룬트 대학 교수님, 준서 칭화대학 교수님, 그리고 스테피의 이종원 부원장님 모든 분들에게 환영과 감사의 인사를 드립니다. 또한 자장과 토론을 맡아주실 이원영 박사님을 비롯한 국내의 전문가 여러분께도 심심한 감사의 말씀을 드립니다. 내외 귀빈 여러분, 지금 현재 한국은 많은 슬픔과 고통으로 사회적인 분위기가 가라앉아 있습니다. 아마 우리 과학기술계도 여기에 일부의 책임은 있는 것 같습니다. 그래서 이러한 사고를 계기로 해서 더욱더 우리의 뒤를 한번 돌아봐야 되지 않을까 생각하는 의미에서 저희 스테피에서는 과학기술 혁신 시스템을 한번 되돌아 보자라는 의미에서 이 심포지움을 개최하였습니다. 지난 반세기 동안 한국 경제의 발전은 성공적인 과학기술 혁신에 있었다는 것은 아마 주지의 사실이라고 생각합니다. 21세기 지식기반 경제에서는 과학기술이 경제는 물론 사회 전반의 발전에 미치는 영향이 더욱 증대될 것이라고 봅니다. 이제 한국도 경제, 사회 발전의 새로운 패러다임을 요구하고 있습니다. 과거 추격형 발전 전략은 이제 더 이상 유효하지 않습니다. 최근 한국 경제가 처한 고용 없는 저성장을 탈피하기 위해서 우리는 새로운 발전 전략을 필요로 하고 있습니다. 이번 박근혜 정부가 출범 초에 내세운 창조 경제는 이러한 위기의식에서 이러한 위기를 탈출하기 위한 경제정책의 일환으로 내세운 국가 아젠다라고 생각합니다. 특히 과학기술과 혁신은 기초가 튼튼한 경제, 역동적인 혁신경제, 그리고 내수와 수출의 균형이라는 한국 경제의 목표를 실현하기 위한 핵심 수단이기도 합니다. 창조 경제로의 전환을 위한 국가 혁신 체제도 따라서 바뀌어야 하며 OECD와 EU 등에서는 이미 글로벌 금융위기, 만성적인 저성장 및 다양한 위험 발생 가능성 등에 대응하기 위해 지속 가능한 성장, 포용적 성장과 같은 새로운 국가 발전 패러다임과 혁신 체제에 대한 논의가 진행되고 있습니다. 오늘 지속적인 성장과 함께 국가 사회적 목표 달성을 추구하기 위하여 국가 혁신 시스템의 발전 모델을 논의하는 것은 우리에게 매우 시의적절한 중요한 주제가 아닐까 생각합니다. 내외 기빈 여러분, 오늘의 심포지움은 한국의 발전에 필요한 혁신 패러다임이 무엇인지를 모색하고 국가 혁신 시스템의 정비를 위해 글로벌 전문가 여러분의 해안을 모으는 장이 될 것입니다. 국가 혁신 체제 논의를 핵심적으로 이끌고 있는 저명한 석학들의 새로운 혁신 패러다임과 정책에 대한 훌륭한 제안은 물론 국내외 전문가들의 심도 있는 토론을 통해 우리나라 국가 혁신 시스템의 새로운 발전 방향이 제시될 수 있기를 바랍니다. 바쁘신 가운데도 불구하고 오늘 저희 과학기술정책연구원 개원 27주년 기념 국제 심포지움에 참석하여 주신 여러분들께 다시 한번 감사의 말씀을 드립니다. 감사합니다.
이어서 바쁜 일정 가운데서 이 자리에서 참석해 주신 과학기술자문회의에 박상대 부의장님의 축사가 있으시겠습니다. 뜨거운 박수로 부탁드리겠습니다.
과학기술 자문회의 부의장에 앞서서 제가 스테피 정책 자문위원장 일을 하고 있어서 제가 늘 스테피 일에는 무료 봉사하고 있습니다. 존경하는 송종국 과학기술정책연구원 원장님, 그리고 과학기술 혁신정책에 대한 논의를 선도하고 이끌고 계신 국내외 석학 및 전문가 여러분 반갑습니다. 오늘 창조경제 국가혁신 시스템을 되돌아보다 라는 주제로 과학기술정책연구원에서 주최하는 국제 심포지움에 참석하게 된 것을 큰 기쁨으로 생각을 합니다. 또한 우리나라 과학기술 정책 분야의 싱크탱크 역할을 훌륭히 수행하고 있는 스테피 개원 27주년을 진심으로 축하드립니다. 반세기 전에 세계 최빈국가의 하나로 변방에 있던 한국이 이제는 세계 10위권의 경제 강국으로 발전하였습니다. 그러나 글로벌 경제 위기 이후 지난 7, 8년간 한국은 저성장과 높은 청년 실업률, 소득 불균형의 문제로 어려움에 직면해 있습니다. 지금 우리는 이러한 한계 상황을 뛰어넘어 새로운 경제 질서를 재편해 나가야 할 동력이 절실히 필요한 때입니다. 박근혜 정부는 그 동력을 창조 경제에서 찾고 있습니다. 이제 한 사람의 뛰어난 아이디어나 창의력 그리고 신기술이 전 세계를 움직이고 그것이 국가 발전에 기여하는 새로운 시대로 바뀌었습니다. 박근혜 정부는 창의성에 기반한 혁신과 노력만이 우리가 직면한 과제들을 해결할 수 있다는 판단하에 창조성을 핵심 가치로 하는 창조경제를 새로운 경제발전의 패러다임으로 추진한 것입니다. 이런 측면에서 이번 국제심포지엄은 창조경제와 경제혁신의 실천이라는 목표 달성과 그리고 저성장 경제에서 혁신 패러다임의 변화라는 시대조국에 부응하기 위해서 국가혁신체제를 재정립해보는 대단히 중요한 자리라고 생각합니다. 아무쪼록 이 심포지엄이 지속가능한 한국형 혁신 시스템의 발전 모델과 역할을 탐색하는 유익한 자리가 되기를 기대하며 이를 통해 상호 보완적이고 발전적인 교류의 장으로 계속 이어나가기를 바랍니다. 제가 속해 있는 과학기술자문회의도 오늘 논의에서 제안되는 과학기술 정책, 혁신 정책의 중요 이제들을 적극 검토해서 창조경제 구현의 과학기술인들의 지혜를 모을 수 있도록 그 역할을 다할 것입니다. 끝으로 본 행사의 성공과 한국의 새로운 발전 방향을 위한 의미 있는 결론이 도출되기를 희망하며 자리를 함께 하신 국내외 기빈 모든 분들의 건승과 행복을 기원합니다. 대단히 감사합니다.
네, 바쁘신 와중에도 저희 스테피 국제심포지엄에 오셔서 귀한 격려와 축하의 말씀 나누셔주신 점 다시 한번 진심으로 감사드립니다. 이제 2014년 스테피 국제심포지엄을 본격적으로 시작하도록 하겠습니다. 올해 주제는 저희가 잡은 것이 창조경제 그리고 국가혁신 시스템이라고 하는 키워드를 가지고 올해 주제를 잡아왔습니다. 말씀해 주신 대로 저희 스테피에서는 이미 1990년대 후반부터 한국의 국가혁신체제라고 하는 한국 국가혁신 시스템 NIS에 대한 내셔널 이노베이션 시스템에 대한 연구들을 계속적으로 진행을 해왔었습니다. 특별히 저희가 이제 추격형 혁신 시스템에서 창조형 혁신 시스템으로 발전해 나가는 과정에 있어서 어떻게 저희가 해안들을 모을지에 대해서 논의하면서 특별히 국내의 많은 석학들을 모시고 이런 심포지엄을 개최해야 된 것을 굉장히 큰 영광으로 생각합니다. 그래서 먼저 저희 네덜란드의 마스트리트 대학의 총장이시면서 여러분들 굉장히 잘 아시는 Economics of Industrial Innovation의 저자이신 룩소테 총장님께서 발표를 해주시도록 하겠습니다. 발표의 주제는 From Creative Destruction to Destructive Creation. 박수로 맞으시기 바랍니다.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, let me thank first of all STEPI for having. Thank you. Let me thank first of all STEPI for having invited me here in Seoul, in beautiful Seoul, and on a very sunny day, very different from what we have today in Europe. And I don't mean this just in physical terms, but also in mental terms, as I will hopefully argue in terms of my presentation today. I will just put on my timer also so that I stick within the limits of the time allocated. My talk is very much in terms of the challenges which a country like Korea will face, but I will not, of course, address directly Korea, having no knowledge really about Korea, and certainly with all the experts here around the table, consider this more as food for thought for particularly in terms of the policy debate later this afternoon. But I will try to address some of the challenges as they are going ahead for countries once they arrive at these technological frontier levels, and they have to some extent no longer the security of what has happened in front of them by other countries. So in this kind of post-catch-up, or in this kind of position of where they are leading countries. I will talk about five just I will basically make 4 reflections. First of all, reflections on the area we represent, technological change, innovation, and the implicit way of why these areas are always considered in a very positive environment. Why do we have always a generally positive view about science, technology, and innovation? And the way this is very much related to opportunities. And as people see opportunities, their creative talents can express themselves by exploiting those opportunities. And the question I will try to address is basically along the line of this whole talk about what there is more than these individual creativities and allowing those to blossom. What there is more if we want to talk about a broader macroeconomic creativity in terms of benefits. I use this in terms of terms which is called creative destruction and destructive creation. I'll come to that. I'll try to explain that in the second part of my talk. And I'll then to move on to 3 examples of such destructive creation. I'll conclude by challenging a little bit the science and research communities and try to observe also what are features of destructive creation in research today. These are very much, as I said, provocative statements. They are basically to challenge you to think a bit further than what we are used to. And from that perspective, they're based on my personal experience in the first part. They're based also on, of course, the literature which I've read myself and my own research experience in the field of industrial innovation. So let me just start a little bit from a very personal reflection. I guess like most other researchers, we seek for research excellence, and so have I done in all my life and my research life, and such as my colleague here also have a sprue history, as many people have, as we were reminded by the president of STEPI. The expertise in this area comes from a number of areas, and it could be coming from the US, of course, in terms of a leading country in terms of science and technology policies since the 50s. It could come from places such as the UK, Sprue, or Manchester in the UK. It comes from a couple of places where there are research groups which existed. And like many of my researchers, we've always been interested in carrying out excellent research. But at the same time, of course, in carrying out excellent research, we've also been trying to change the environment within which we carried out that research. So to some extent change the opportunities which are around you. And so there is an interaction in terms of opportunities which you face, which you try to optimize for your own personal need, personal satisfaction, and then benefit from these changing environments in terms of finding new opportunities for entrepreneurial research. To some extent, this is the research creativity I'm talking about, and this is very much, I think, also some of the aims we are discussing here in terms of the 3-year program which the Korean government has today. And what you observe, of course, is very much that these skills you require as a research entrepreneur in terms of these challenges, etc., that these skills are typically not straightforward in academics, and that academics is very much an individual excellence research activity, which is often based on the search for reputation, the search for recognition, the search for citations, etc. So to some extent you, in my view, and this is very much a personal reflection which I'll come back at the end of my talk to, it is that if you really talk about research entrepreneurship in terms of organization, you need very different skills from the research skills which you need as an individual researcher. And I've called this humility. I don't know if this is the correct word, but it is indicative of the whole line of my talk, of what I will try to talk about, which is basically that you try to find ways, opportunities, which either are opportunities which you satisfy your own personal individual needs, which are very much a function about the career perspectives you have, your individual career opportunities, or alternatively you put this in function of some other more broader, more general, more team aim, which could be this interaction with the environment within which you operate, and which could involve other features. And so my first issue is really, come back to that, is that this is really possibly highlighting a difference between, on the one hand, the search for individual reputation, individual recognition, and the search for changes in the organizational environment within which research is carried out. I've called this here this kind of interaction between knowing as social scientists in general that the divine glory of the ego is socially a great nuisance, yet as individual academic researchers we are all obsessed by it. And so we love recognition, but primarily with respect to ourselves, whereas if you look at it from a social perspective, it is really the recognition at a broader level. Anyhow, this is a sort of an issue which I'll come back to in the end when I will reflect on research. But let me come to my main challenge and my main issue, which I would like to bring before you. And this is this kind of vision we've had in this whole area, and going back from the early 50s down to the 10s in the last period, is this continuous, very clear interaction between innovation studies and positivism. Innovation is good for you appears a common feature of most science, technology, and innovation studies over the last decades. And in some of the presentations when I made this first talk and I first presented some of those ideas here at SPRU for the Maria Hoda annual lecture, memorial lecture, I put in a Guinness advert here, because Guinness, if you remember, the Irish beer always had Guinness is good for you. And the issue about Guinness being good for you is that it had a different texture, which has a lot of antioxidants in this beer, and that apparently is good for the blood circulation, etc. And at the time when Guinness was I think about 20, 30 years ago, Guinness offered a free pint of Guinness in blood donor clinics, etc., to people who were giving for free blood, etc. Since that, Guinness and the marketing people at Guinness have clearly stopped Guinness from doing so, because they did not want Guinness to become a health company selling, of course, beer. And so, but it's a good idea to see that this idea that innovation is similarly is good for you, and it's good for the health of the economy. There is a similarity there which is striking. And of course the issue is that this is to some extent surprising, because I think many of us have learned in their academic environment that innovation failure is much more common than innovation success at the micro level within companies. And that basically, I refer back to the old SAFO project at the Science Policy Research Unit in Sussex, which highlighted that learning from failure was much more interesting than learning from success, because it was out of these failures that you could see really those variables which were common in each of these micro cases of innovation failure, and the similarities in there pointed to some features which could indeed be avoided in terms of innovation processes. And from that perspective, the issue about how you could improve innovation was very much related to the acceptance that in generally innovation fails rather than is a success. And of course at the macro level, similarly, we have a lot of historical studies going down from Brian Arthur to Paul David to Paul Stoneman to many other authors, showing how we can lock into particular technological trajectories. We are locked in a combustion fuel engine in the motor car industry for years. We've been locked in various technologies with very significant consequences for the long term. That is that the adjustment from one position to another, think for instance about the ecological challenges we are facing today, it's very difficult to get out of one technological trajectory into another, even if we adjust in terms of prices, because this locking in means that we are basically stuck with particular technological infrastructures, technological features. And so again here too, failure in the sense of the long term at the macro level, there is a lot of evidence about how certain systems of technology have failed. Systemic failures are also very characteristic of the introduction of new technologies. You only have to look at, in my own country or in Europe more generally, the amount of failures from Concorde to Minitel to many other cases of large failures within the system are again characteristics of the introduction of new technologies and of innovation. And finally, similarly, at the level of employment, we have very similar features, reflect on the technological unemployment problems some countries, some regions, some sectors have been confronted with. With Chris Freeman, I've written a lot on the issues about the interaction between technology and employment, and the issue about how technologies will displace particular employment, particular skills, etc., which could lead even at a macroeconomic level to substantial macroeconomic problems, is also something where the literature is full of those features. So how come that at the policy level we have this continuous, totally positive view about science, technology and innovation? Well, as I try to argue, the reason for this is that we have interpreted these failures as challenges, as structural change challenges, which we've defined as creative destruction. And this creative destruction notion, as it goes back to Joseph Schumpeter, is very much a notion which is trying to highlight the structural change which occurs either at the level of an organization, challenging an organization, by which some organizations will indeed die, but new organizations will emerge, and as such, at the macro level, structural change of this kind of creative destruction type is positive. It allows the system to move up to a higher level, to get through a transition, so to say, to a higher level of economic growth, economic development, welfare, whatever. And so Schumpeter, and whether this goes through a period of crisis, such as in Schumpeter's long-term work, the whole socialism, democracy, capitalism, in which he described this long-term cyclical movement of the way this occurred, or whether you go to the earlier young Schumpeter in terms of the entrepreneurial innovator, so to say, who was really challenging the established order. In both cases, the structural change leads ultimately to a better, improved, higher level of development. And so there will be, the cost will be, the destroying feature are the few incumbents, the few large, possibly companies, institutions, organizations, which are being destroyed to the benefit of many newcomers. That is really the core, the essence of this notion of creative destruction. What I'll try to do here is to argue that the opposite, what I've called destructive creation, might also exist. And this opposite, destructive creation, is basically something which has exactly the opposite features, that is that it benefits a few at the expense of many. And so it has the opposite effect, that is that it leads to a decline in your overall welfare. And you know why this could happen is I try to show this as examples of why this has happened, but why this could happen is basically because you have confronted with a number of features which are very much related to some of those failures which I described a minute earlier in terms of both at the micro and at the macro level. And so this common feature in terms of destructive creation is that there is creativity there. Creativity is at the center of the whole process, but the creativity is of a very easy, free rider nature and is depending on the networks which exist and the regulatory framework. So basically it is innovation which is inspired by regulation. It's innovation which is basically where the network provides opportunities. That's why I started with this very personal assessment of this kind of interaction between opportunism and individual research entrepreneurship. And once you find, for instance, in a network the crucial nodes and you combine these nodes in a network and you don't bother about the non-profitable aspects of the network, you have there typically what I've called here these easy free rider opportunities for creativity. And in this sense, this existed, of course, throughout time. This has always existed. But basically, there was always this interaction between, on the one hand, failure and the market, and the way the market challenged, of course, these destructive creation opportunities, and on the other hand, regulation. Because the regulatory framework, adjusted, of course, did not allow these particular creativity features to emerge. But my point is that why these possibilities for destructive creation have blossomed over the last 10 years, more or less, so to say, 10, 15 years, is basically because of the way in which the systems have become much more transparent, globalized, and in which information and communication technologies, digital technologies, have of course played a major central role. And again, you see this, and of course here within the STEPI, etc., is not just science technology, it's also information technologies, and that's why I want to emphasize this in particular. Because what happens typically for information communication technologies is that they have a tremendous growth impact. This is why we've called these technologies pervasive. These technologies have this kind of what we call this general purpose impact. They affect every sector. They have a tremendous nature of opportunities of enabling economic growth because of the transparency. In microeconomic terms, basically you have this demand curve, which can nearly, the demand curve of society in particular areas can nearly be individualized. You can individually satisfy it. You can explode the numbers of the variety of products and services which you can deliver. Think of a cheap flight, think of various other opportunities by which the service is differentiated amongst marginal features and therefore allows a tremendous opportunity for economic growth, for new opportunities for delivering the same service in a different variety. And this is typically what we've called the long tail of product and service delivery differentiation. You can expand this, and according to every need, the high income, the high price variety versus the low price variety, you can differentiate each of these services, so to say. And of course this has had a tremendous growth opportunity, growth impact, welfare impact. The consumer wants along the full consumer curve have been more or less satisfied. And these new versions have been explaining the tremendous growth of new sectors as they have emerged. New growth sectors in the high segment or in the low consumer segments. The question though, and this has been addressed by many authors already of course, is the extent to which such differentiation, thanks to information communication technologies, thanks to these digital technologies, to what extent this also has led to the opportunities for, again, opportunities and innovation for cherry picking, for just providing the service of the segments of demand which are the most profitable ones at the expense of the less profitable ones. So what you get is basically that the full service delivery has been reduced. And this is very logic, because the regulatory framework, which basically existed about one service for everybody, is now exploded, so to say, in terms of a differentiated service delivery, and the universal principles of universal service delivery are just limited to some basic characteristic of access to the product. Think of services in the telecom area, or services to internet, or services also of electricity, of water, of train, of mobility, etc. In each of these areas, you could say, and the statistics show this, it has become increasingly expensive to be poor. Because in general it are the poor segments of your society who of course were benefiting from the universal service provision. And by the explosion, so to say, of the service delivery, that part of the demand curve has been, on the one hand, a demand curve which has been actively exploited. Think of cheap travel, or think of cheap mortgages, or various other forms of innovation at the bottom end of your demand curve. But at the same time, it has also become increasingly expensive to be poor, because you will have to pay for each of those services, whereas before they were often within the internal subsidy of the total service delivery, they were part of those same services. And from this perspective, it's surprising whether, and you will see in my examples which I will use of this kind of destructive creation processes, that they each time have to do with a regulator which wasn't there, which was late, which wasn't aware of the opportunities there were in this network service delivery, of opportunities of segmenting the demand curve, and by which some parts of this demand curve have been disconnected, so to say. So regulation-driven innovation and innovation which is just inspired by circumventing regulation, thanks to digital technologies, was really in opposition to the regulator himself, which was ill-prepared in the sense that he wasn't aware of the changes which were going to happen or could happen, of the many new digital opportunities. And so to some extent, he basically did not sufficiently realize the negative social externalities or the possible systemic failures. Now all this sounds maybe too much theoretical and abstract notions, and that's why I will try to, of course, illustrate how this operates within a framework which is much more based on hard actual facts. So let me quickly move on. I skipped this, you can read it, but basically this is the question about why we don't have in this process, just as we have it with technologies where we have this precautionary principle about technology assessment, why we don't have in the framework here, we don't have innovation assessment in the same way when innovation is purely inspired by regulation. So let me come, as I said, let me come quickly to my 3 cases of destructive creation. And again, this is just to highlight that this is something which we probably didn't think, reflect at the level of science and technology policy and study science and technology policy is sufficiently about these cases, etc. And therefore there are 3 very differentiated cases, but I could present you with many other of such cases of what I've called here destructive creation. The first is, of course, the most obvious one, and the one where Korea is, of course, leading in terms of trying to address the issue, which is, of course, green technologies and the ecologically unsustainable nature of economic development we are confronted with. And, of course, that ecologically unsustainable development pattern has many elements to it. It has an element of production engineering, it has an element of distribution of goods and services. I will address myself here, I limit myself here purely to what I've called here unsustainable innovation-led consumerism. I'll come then to a second example, which is of course financial innovation, which is a very nice and of course a very neat example of pure destructive creation. These are really financial innovations very much inspired by digital technologies, offering all kinds of opportunities and how they lead to an increase in the systemic risk at the level of the macroeconomy. And the third, as an institutional innovation, I'll just give you the example of the euro as another example of an institutional innovation with a systemic risk, whereas at the initial phase, this appeared again a typical example of destructive creation. So, as I put here, in each of these cases, the solution to these problems of destructive creation will have to be found in strengthening society's capacity to develop innovations of the welfare-enhancing, creative, destructive type, the opposite type, the ones which really lead to increases in welfare. And again, whereas I've put it here very nicely, because of course here I am with all my Korean friends, so whereas Korea could well be the best practice case of how this capacity has been strengthened in the past, the issue is of course how you do this in the future in a post-catch-up framework of a leading science and technology country. So let me come to my first example. Innovation, planned obsolescence and unsustainable consumption. Well, this is basically the one area where there is a lot of economic modeling and economic theory evidence in new growth theory, and I refer here to Emilio Calvano's economic model, which highlights this very neatly, and in which you can show that it is in the interest of individual companies to have an innovation process which is based on continuously trying to innovate rapidly, because you make much more money with new versions of your new products than you would make by trying to compete on prices at the world level. And we have all examples continuously around us. In practically in each of our pockets we have examples of this, by which each version of your new iPhone or smart computer or smart tablet or whatever you will be induced by the companies to buy the new version, which adds some feature, which is basically inspired by the simple fact that the so-called the monopoly profits which the companies can make on those innovations, the monopoly rents are of that nature that basically you plan obsolescence. You want to have consumers replace their iPad of that nature or their iPhone of that nature with the next one, because if they keep going to continue to buy the old one, you have to compete on price and you will be competed out. And so Emilio Calvano illustrates this very neatly. He basically shows, and this is a pure economic mathematical model which illustrates this very neatly. If you want to, you can look it up, but it shows very neatly that destructive creation unambiguously leads to higher profits whatever the innovation costs. And so in that sense, this is not surprising at all. It leads you to firms to go for these higher profits and hence to be occupied. It is what we've called planned obsolescence. You will make sure that the battery in the products you sell have a time period which is limited so that people will be forced to buy, or that the timing is exactly in line with the new generation of goods consumers buy. This goes back a long time. This is not something which is associated so much with information communication technology. If you remember the first nylon stockings, the advertising for the nylon stockings was that you could pull a truck with the stockings and they would not break. And very soon afterwards, the first American companies producing nylon stockings, of course, reduced the strength of the technology so that at least the stockings would break regularly, so that there would be an inducement mechanism that one would buy regularly new stockings, etc. So in this sense, this is something which has always existed, but it is exploded, so to say, with information and communication consumer technologies, because the issue is basically, it's written here in this first bullet point, the power to wreck the value of old versions of a product ends up restoring profits. So if you are busy producing a particular good, it is in your interest to introduce a new version, a new variety of that good, basically because that destroys the value of all the consumers of the existing stock, because for consumers, of course, the new variety has the new value, and the old variety declines, is basically made obsolete. And so this is an issue whereby what basically Calvano highlights is that this exists across the board, and that this sort of form of destructive creation is widespread, very much induced by new ICT goods, etc. And so I can go very quickly here. This destructive creation exists. Basically, it hinders the prolonged usage and induces customers to migrate continuously to newer models. Paul David, a good colleague of mine, etc. I give you a couple of examples here of fashion clothing, shoes, many other ICT products where the limiting of the backward compatibility of electronic goods manufacturing, ceasing to supply essential after-sales services or spare parts for older products, the legal case brought against Apple in 2003 with respect to the planned obsolescence of the battery life of the batteries of the iPad, etc., etc. Clearly, in each of these cases, Paul David called this the innovation fetish Imelda Marcos syndrome, in memory of a famous instance of the uncontrollable obsessive accumulation of more and more pairs of women's shoes, another richly documented fetish object. But it's just to show that you can have in there a kind of never satisfied consumer need by which our economic models are basically undermined in a system that is that companies are inspired to basically continuously consume. Well, consumers consume and companies to continuously innovate to produce new consumer goods with marginal varieties in the product itself. And as I've argued here, this conspicuous innovation consumption growth path, which in its environmental impact and ecological footprint is not only unsustainable in the developed world but also at the global level, warrants basically a shift in the process of research and innovation. This is basically, I would say, the first big challenge which you're confronted with in terms of this one example of how do you move from this destructive creation to creative destruction. And my case is here that basically you have to get back, and this is quite fundamental, a very fundamental challenge is how do I get back from a system which has been totally dominated by what I've called the professional use demand. So what I try to convince the average consumer is that the needs of the professional user are the needs which he also requires. So basically continuously more sophisticated needs. That basically can I direct this away from the tip of the income pyramid. For instance, I will buy a tennis racket which have a spin of a particular variety, etc. when I barely can play tennis. Or I will buy whatever sunglasses or other glasses which are based for situations which are extreme. I will have all kind of varieties in the technology inspired contributions in terms of my consumer goods which are barely used ever as an average consumer. How do I move from the tip of the income pyramid to basically the long tail, the other part of the income pyramid, etc. And so this is basically here where I put in a couple of ideas which are reflected, but which are much more in general terms, in terms of low income innovations, sometimes called bottom of the pyramid innovations, such as Prahalat has advanced, and local grassroots innovations. You see that suddenly there come in lots of new ideas of innovations. The main point is, and I don't have to explain this figure, that at the aggregate level, if we have indeed the development of countries which goes from the direction of, say, if Korea and countries here are at that level, and this is of course the ecological footprint level in which we try countries to be below that level in terms of the ecological footprint. Sorry, I'm putting the graph upside down. This is the ecological footprint here of 2, which is more or less sustainable at the global level. And you see that all these countries here are way ahead in terms of the ecological footprint. But if you simply look here at the Human Development Index, which is an alternative, say, to GDP per capita, you can see that we have lots of poor countries are within the Earth's ecological footprint, but if they develop like other countries in this direction, this will be totally unsustainable. So we have basically 2 challenges: to keep countries of low development levels within the ecological footprint line of the world. And we have the other problem, which is basically that the developed world countries need to reduce their ecological footprint to come back in the ecological sustainable footprint. And the big danger is, of course, that if we enter into this kind of consumer path which I described, these countries will just grow in this direction if they further develop. Just as, for instance, typical examples as the Middle Eastern countries, etc., with their very high ecological footprint consumption patterns. I will skip this given the time. I will move on to my second example, if you don't mind. You can read it in the slide there if you're more interested, but I will move quickly on given the time left. I will move on to the second example. I still have my clock here 6 minutes, so I have to speed up. The second example is the one which I think will probably raise far less issues and questions with you, because it's financial innovations. And financial innovations, and there are lots of papers which have used actually the term of destructive creation when talking about financial innovations. So they have been well studied. And again here, let me first strongly argue that financial innovations, when they were introduced, such as credit default swaps or securitization models, etc., were innovations in the real sense of the word. They were not imaginary wind-making innovations or illustration of the lack of knowledge of risk management with financial experts. Financial experts were very much aware of the risks involved in these products. They were indicated in the description of the products. The issue is that these products, at the time they were introduced, were considered as products which would be using the international dimensions of financial exchange, of financial opportunities, combining, for instance, the word securitization says it very well. You secure the risks within the package, the portfolio of various stocks and bonds which you combine in these products. The same with credit default swaps. It is precisely, again, to reduce the risks of the individual financial investor, etc. But in each case, it's exactly the example of what I've talked about. It is the example of a creativity at the individual bank level or individual product level, whereby the systemic risks are pushed to the rest of the system, to society. So it is the benefit of a few to the detriment, in this case, to the risks of many. So it is basically pushing the risk of the overall system upwards into the rest of the financial system. And the regulators were basically, they didn't pay attention, or they're not aware of these new innovative opportunities. Society missed basically an innovation tool here. And if you look at the examples, well, let me just remind you of this quote of, it's of course very unfair to quote policymakers years after things have happened, but nevertheless, just remember Greenspan, Alan Greenspan's quote in 2005, recent regulatory reform coupled with innovative technologies has stimulated development of financial products such as asset-backed securities, collateral loan obligations and credit default swaps that facilitate the dispersion of risk. These increasingly complex financial instruments have contributed to the development of a far more flexible, efficient and hence resilient financial system than the one that existed just a quarter century ago. End of quote. So if, in the words of the Fed chairman, this statement made in 2005, and when you see what has happened since or what has happened afterwards, you can see that typically the regulator wasn't aware at all about the way this destructive creation, innovations, would lead to an overall financial risk in the global system, based on these easy, free rider, short-term opportunities of picking out cherries to the cost of many in the same way. What then, similarly, what is then the solution to these creative or to this destructive creation innovations in the financial sector? Well, the answer, and this is the funny part, of course, the answer is very well known by most financial specialists within the sector itself. This all involves, again, creative destruction. That is that a number of incumbents, a number of within the sector itself, there is a need for a cleanup of that sector, but the sector will, of course, never do it by itself. This is the whole idea of the Schumpeterian process of creative destruction. That is that the creativity within the sector will not emerge to do this process of creative destruction. And the specialists, of course, which know all these solutions are employed within the sector itself. So the list which I've put here just for sake of information, the list of the required reform is long, little progress has been made. Return of transparency into accountancy, forbidding destabilizing naked short sales, banning information, hitting off balance sheets, construct responsibility of the selling agency for the information giving, dropping sales provision, etc. Read any of the big advisory reports for the Bank of England, for the European Commission, etc. You'll find the whole list. Implementation, zero. And so you typically have here the example that we know what is the regulatory need, what we have to do with the implementation, because we're stuck in this mode of destructive creation. We cannot get within that sector itself. And I think this is where, in both these cases, and I will skip, given the time, I will skip the euro, so let me move on to just pay a bit more attention to this feature here. In both these cases, you have unsustainable consumption and finance point to the negative social externalities accompanying innovation not having been addressed by regulators. And I think this is really where I think economic theory and economic insights can help policymakers. Because I think that, and referring to, for instance, to the Nobel Prize in 2007 of Leon Hurwitz, Aaron Maskin, and Robert Meyerson, it really has to do with finding the sort of design technique, the game design technique, to get behavioral changes in operation which fit you, which lead you in terms of what the regulator, what the policy maker wants. And so in this sense, as I put it here, such an architecture can be simple. It starts from the way citizens act, representing their individual freedom, whereby the mechanism design is so that human coordination mechanisms achieve higher valuations from citizens than if left at the mercy of the uncoordinated expression of their actions. And as my colleague Arnold Heertje, Dutch economist, put it once, parents who give their 2 children a cake and leave the distribution to the freedom of the kids will create conflict. Avoiding conflict without universal orders and prohibitions, a simple stimulus, A, kid 1 divides the cake and B, kid 2 chooses, will do. In society, it is no different. I'll conclude, ladies and gentlemen, because my time is up, with just the last part, which I just draw your attention in the conclusions that you as a country, just as the Netherlands or Europe as a country, is confronted with the way in which we generate and we allow creativity to lead us ahead in terms of creating more welfare. And in that challenge, the challenge is, in my view, not just that we should go continuously for the process of saying that every innovation is good for you, but that the situation is much more complex and that we have to pay much more attention in the way these innovations lead indeed to processes, possible processes of creative destruction, i.e. to the detriment of a few but to the benefit of many, but do not lead to the situation, as I've tried to explain, which is pretty common in society, where innovations have led to destructive creation. Thank you for your attention.